This is Tracy Siska from the Chicago Justice Project. Welcome to our Chicago Justice Show. We're really excited today to have Eddie Bocanegra, Senior Director at READI Chicago, a project of the Heartland Alliance, Vaughn Bryant, Executive Director of Community Partners for Peace, or CP4P, which is how we're going to be responding to it, or talking about it, and Peter Cunningham, Communications Consultant for Chicago CRED. So we'll get to them in just 1 minute. I just want to give you all a little bit about CJP. Every Wednesday night at 7 p.m. Central, we have our gathering, our weekly strategy session for what we're calling CJP Nation, which is an advocacy wing of our organization. But also it brings together volunteers from all over the country, interns, and they work on group crowdsourced research projects. Some of them are social media ambassadors for the program. So if you're looking to get involved in transparency work, not just in Chicago, but around the country, because we're expanding, that's a great place to do it. There's the link. And also this show, which is usually Wednesdays, 12 to 1 Central, is expanding on March 1st. We're going to go 3 days a week, streaming in the evenings starting at 5:30 Central, Monday, Wednesday, Friday. Okay. Gentlemen, thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it.
Nice to be here.
Thank you for having us.
Okay, so I'm going to let's do a little introduction about what each of your organizations do, and then we'll get into the heart of some of the questions. So, Vaughn, Communities Partnering for Peace, or CP4P, at least on your website, says, is a framework that provides comprehensive long-term approach to reducing violence and gang activity among individuals and communities it serves. Can you give us a high-level view of what CP4D does, a little more than that?
Yeah, so CP4P is actually a collaborative of 16 organizations that Metropolitan Peace Initiatives, we convene that group. And each group does a combination of street outreach work, case management work. We have a place-based strategy called Light in the Night, where we have events in those communities 3 nights a week during the summer and once a month, fall, winter, spring. And then we host what we call a Metropolitan Peace Academy, where we train all of the outreach workers across the network and beyond on how to do street outreach work, providing professional standards to the work, and really making it a job that you can do that, can potentially launch you into other jobs.
Awesome. Okay, so Eddie, let's talk a little bit about READI. On your website, you guys talk about, we are driven to decrease shootings and homicides among those highest risk for gun violence, creating new opportunities for the same individuals to change their trajectory. How do you do that?
Well, ironically, launched in 2017, READI Chicago is pretty much an innovative approach to respond to gun violence in our city of Chicago. It connects people who are at the highest risk of gun involvement or victimization to cognitive behavior therapy, paid professional jobs, as well as additional support social services, particularly in specific communities in our city, through 6 various partners that are embedded in these communities, both in the south side and the west side of Chicago.
Okay, wonderful. So Peter, let's turn to you in Chicago CRED. Among other things, I know this is more of I'm going to say, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, this is more about economic changes. Let me know if that's right. But I know Arnie Duncan is the executive director, the leader of the organization. I know all these organizations work together. So can you give me a little bit about what Chicago CRED does?
Sure. It was founded in 2016 by Arnie, who's the former Secretary of Education, and he was the CEO of the Chicago Public Schools, lifelong Southside resident who grew up with a lot of kids who were at risk and always cared deeply about them. So what we do is similar to what both of the other organizations do. We're all in some different neighborhoods. We focused a lot on the far south side in Roseland. We intervene with the guys who are most at risk. We try and get them to put down their guns, give them therapy, we give them support, we give them a paycheck, which is important because, most of them are just trying to survive and they have to eat. Some of them have to pay rent. They got to take care of their families. And so we give them a paycheck. We try and train them to give them jobs. We give them therapy. We give them support. We give them life coaches. We give them whatever it takes to put down their guns and stop shooting. Over the years, we've adapted the model. We originally thought that getting these guys jobs is the end zone. But it sometimes takes more than that. Sometimes you have to really stay with them for several years. So we're just adapting and learning about how to do this. It's a constant state of self-reflection to make sure we're watching our guys, keeping an eye on them. But we're very proud that the research applying to all three organizations suggests that we're making a positive difference.
Okay, so if I'm going to put you a little bit on the spot here, what are the top three most pressing social problems that the communities and individuals your organizations deal with are facing, if you had to rank them? And anyone can jump in.
I'll give you one.
Okay.
I think that the years of systemic oppression is probably the biggest contextual thing in my mind, because if we're just talking Chicago and we want to make it the most recent, if you look at the history of redlining in our city and the inability for mostly Black but also brown people to not be able to benefit from one of the largest wealth generating mechanisms in the world, in the country at least, and for the United States, that has a generational effect in terms of accumulating wealth and then sustaining neighborhoods, attracting businesses, driving out poverty. It has an impact on education attainment. So I think that's the biggest thing I would say in terms of getting to the root.
As a matter of fact, I want to just contextualize something of what Vaughn just mentioned, right? Through READI, we have a very small sample of individuals that we've been serving. So we've served roughly about 1,200 men through engagement of street outreach, but close to 700 of them, 680 so men, have taken advantage of the job and the CBT, some additional services along the way. But just to kind of give you a snapshot into what Vaughn is also pointing out here. So through police data, hospital data, we know that on average, our men in our program have 17 to 18 arrests. We know that 60% of them have done prison time. We know that over 80% of them have been victims of violence. Either they've been stabbed, shot, or assaulted. As a matter of fact, we talk about violence prevention, but ultimately, a lot of the men that we all work with here have been victims of violence, generally speaking. In READI Chicago, we have had about 240 men out of the close to 680 men that I mentioned. They've been victims of shootings. They're survivors of gun violence. So that's 1/3 of the people that we serve. So again, building on what Vaughn just mentioned, I think about, one of the challenges for us is understanding that the oppression, the systemic challenges that we face today have been inherited, right, for many generations. And what we're seeing right now is a byproduct, right, of disinvestment, of lack of opportunity and access. So for your average listener who might say, well, so much money is going into violence prevention efforts, that is true, but there's way much more money going into punitive approaches as opposed to caring for people and fully grasping the fact that you are dealing with families who've been impacted by violence. You are dealing with families who have been separated because of the criminal justice system. To take, for example, the war on drugs. And there's other examples that I could give around that, right? But ultimately, our communities that we're working in right now, there's lack of opportunity for access of employment. There's actually lack of opportunities for upward mobility. We're seeing more and more residents in these communities leaving our city, which to me means also less taxpayers' dollars going into the system to support these kind of services as well. So again, there's a lot that could be deconstructed here, but I think that for your average audience, they have to understand that it's not just about, telling someone to put their gun down or providing a program for them, right? I heard Vaughn said this before. We're not going to be able to program our way out of the situation. There has to be implications around policy changes, removing stigmas and barriers, and really meeting the people where they're at and building from that point on.
Yeah, one of the ways we often talk about this is that we see it as a public health problem, not a crime problem. And as long as we see it only as a crime problem, we're going to continue to approach it the same way, which is to try and arrest our way out of the problem. And that hasn't worked. and it's not going to work. But what does work is when you start to look at all those root causes, as Vaughn mentioned, the structural racism that has denied wealth building opportunities in the African American community. It's denied entrepreneurship opportunities. It's resulted in less housing opportunities. It results in worse public health outcomes, actual health outcomes. There's so many implications of it. And when you really embrace all of those dimensions of an unhealthy community, you begin to understand why gun violence emerges as an outcome. And that's kind of the way more and more we're thinking about this. It's a public health issue.
Let me add another point to this.
Please.
Is that you will often hear people say, well, this person made it. How come everyone can't? And I think we have to be careful about that mindset. If we have a community where 10% of the people make it, but then we have another community where 90% of the people make it, then there's a structural challenge there. And we shouldn't be asking why the 10% made it as much as what is going on that only 10% made it. Because as a government, as a society, we should be creating conditions for every person to be on a path to a dignified life, right? And if they're not, then we need to, look at ourselves, look at our structure. And I think you can't not acknowledge, sort of our political climate today and the polarization, politicians being more about themselves and their own reelection versus really being truly public servants and doing what's best for the people they serve. All of those things play a role in the society that we have today. And this gun violence is only a symptom, a byproduct of larger issues. And we're still not really fully addressing the true root causes just yet. I think all of us, what we're doing is trying to create a place where people can go who want to go to a different path, so that the healing that is necessary, it's going to take a long, long time, given how long it took us to get to this point, because people are, the level of trauma with is staggering. It is staggering. And we do this every day, and I'm still like, wow, like it's going to take us, decades to get out of this situation we're in.
Yeah, to your point, that has always annoyed the crap out of me, because if you look at white communities, white middle class communities specifically, or higher, that one person, like the 10% you're talking about in these communities, that 10% in the white media, middle class and above, that ends up becoming the CEO of some corporation, right? And then the other like 75, 80%, they quote unquote make it because they live reasonably comfortable lives and they live in safer communities, right? And they've got reasonable access to healthcare and education, mortgages, reasonable mortgages, not the ones where they steal you blind, all of that stuff. So that 10% thing, why can't that person, this is always, you don't understand, because they've made it, if you compare them to, if you try to compare it to how other people in their community are at the level they've made it to. They've made it there, but they haven't made it to fulfill what is most likely would have been their destiny if they had equal opportunity, given their talents and whatever else drive they have that's within them. So they've only made it to a level, and that level is where the society's, the white middle class society is happy to let them go to. You can get there, that's fine. We'll take one out of 100 or 1,000 of you. That's fine. But the rest have to stay down there. We're not help. They just have to work harder like you. That has always bothered me to no end, that question. So you guys talked about it a little bit, and I'm going to talk about it now. And I want you guys to comment. I am a huge fan of what your organizations do, but I have been criticized in the past. I think there's only so much, as Eddie said, there's only so much programs. There's only so much success that is possible from your programs. Even if they were to hit at 100% every day, all the time, there's only so much that you're going to change, you're going to be possible to create. I would think real change as far as like economic opportunities the idea would be to run your organizations out of business.
Yes.
Right. That's what we need. We need city that has policies and a state and a country that has policies in lifting up these communities and building them so that we don't need your organizations to do what they're doing. Am I wrong? Where do you fall on that?
I think anytime you do a social service or any kind of clinical work or and you're in the helping field, you're empower people to live an autonomous life. So absolutely, that's true. And the unfortunate truth is sometimes people, like that problems exist because they think that's what gets them a job. When the reality is there'll be something else for you to do. And you have to trust that doing the right thing for the right thing's sake is going to, empower people and that our lives can be good without, as many helpers as we need now. But we're not close to that right now. Like, we don't have enough people to help the people that do need help at the level that they need it. So yes, but we're still climbing uphill right now in terms of, if you think about psychologists or licensed clinical social workers, school counselors, teachers, the need, we don't, the need is so great that we can't keep up with that need right now.
Sorry. The other thing that I would mention as well is that how do we prioritize, right, our needs? I think the best example that I could share, and we're living through it right now, is COVID. I think what COVID disclosed to us as a nation, that the public sector and the social service sector wasn't really ready to embrace the challenges that came with COVID in terms of preparing, supporting families or individuals, thinking about the criminal justice system, the prison system, for example, a vulnerable population, whether people would agree to that or not. They are, they're wards of the state, and they had difficult times in really, supporting and caring for them. And what that reveals to me is how, as a nation, we have prioritized punitive approaches, punishment versus rehabilitation, or versus supporting individuals who are struggling through whatever situation they're going through. Particularly as we learn more and more about this issue around race and equity, as an example. The other part I would say is that we often make excuses about whose lives are worth more than others. And again, sticking to the COVID example, I'm extremely proud in which our governor here in the state of Illinois, Governor Pritzker, was able to mobilize his entire team, the entire state, where they were able to reduce the exposure of COVID. Think about process and hospitals, right, to receive individuals who were diagnosed with COVID. So as a nation, as a state, we came together, state, county, local officials, and so on. And I can't help but to think to myself, wow, we were very quick to mobilize around this specific issue. And it probably has to do that the vaccine, that COVID-19 didn't discriminate based on race, class, or gender, even though we know today that in poor communities of color, they tend to be the highest exposed, and individuals who are more easy to be receptive to the virus. But I have to wonder, why is it that as a state or as a government, we don't prioritize gun violence? We had 769 people killed last year. And I scratch my head and say, how many more homicides do we have to have so that we could give the same level of attention and urgency that we do to COVID or any other infectious diseases? And the sad part is, like, what lives are valued more than others? And that goes back to the earlier comments that Vaughn mentioned. It's about this issue around systemic racism as well. In some cases, very, outspoken and very visual. In other cases, it's not. So that is also a big challenge for what we're grappling right now, and for your listeners, again, for those who have more conservative points of view, that they're funding programs, we're paying taxes to these programs. But the truth is, as Vaughn mentioned again, we're serving a very small population in comparison to what the need really exists.
Okay, I have a question for all of you. You can either jump in. I know your programs haven't been around a long time, but Are you seeing a marked difference in the way the city's responding to these issues? Um, if you were around long enough for Daily, then we transitioned to Rom, and now we're into Lightfoot. Has there been a marked difference in how the city's responding to these things under those administrations?
Well,
I
yeah,
can
I mean,
tell
I
you, I
think
worked for the. Go ahead, Vaughn.
yeah, I would just say there's no question there's a difference in the sense that we now have an offense of violence reduction under this new mayor. We have around an $11 million budget now, where prior to 2020, there was, maybe $1 million here and there that they invested. So they definitely have stepped up in terms of their investment. And as we said in the beginning, the initial investment was a down payment, and that they need to do more, and I trust that they will do more. This is the first time the city, county, and the state have all sort of invested in violence prevention at the level that they're at. But again, as Eddie said, it's not close to enough in terms of where we need to be to really fully address the issue. So it has to be a larger investment, and it has to be a sustained investment for a long period of time. So we're just in the beginning stages.
Yeah, I was going to say I worked for the Daley administration, and back in the '90s, when he announced community policing as a new approach to fighting crime, but he was also an advocate of sort of the broken windows theory of policing, which holds that if you take care of small issues, it will discourage worst kinds of crime. So, for example, he made a big effort to tow away abandoned cars and to remove abandoned buildings. So that was a long time ago. And in some ways, it may have appeared like it worked because the 1990s were the worst period in the city's history, I believe. And then by the 2000s, it had started to come down. By 2010, we were down around 500 homicides a year. So by some measures, it appeared that things were doing better. Then, we got to 2016 where it shot way up again. Then it started going back down again. Then it went way up again last year. So I think some of these approaches, as Vaughn said, we have a real Office of Violence Prevention, which we never really had before. We never really had a direct outreach program like the kinds that our organizations are all running, where that works directly with the young men most at risk. So that's really, really different. But community policing is sort of coming back and making a comeback. I don't think the broken windows theory is coming back in any big way.
Yeah.
I think
if I could add
important to point out, let me just correct one thing. We did have a smaller outreach initiative. I think Ceasefire and Cure Violence for a long time. We're doing this work, not at the scale that we're doing it today, but I think without them, I don't think that we could have ramped up as quickly as we did when the three of us got started, because the work they did to kind of set the foundation is important to point out. Go ahead, Eddie.
Yeah, no, I was going to say, so I have a slightly different perspective on the question or the answers, right? So on a positive note, I do sing praise for the city stepping up and creating an Office of Violence Prevention. I know it's one of several dozens across the country, and it is great that our city created that space because it acknowledges that there's a need there, right? A need that has gone unaddressed. Vaughn mentioned $11 million, and he mentioned that it's a starting point, it's a down payment to, right? I've heard Arnie mention this as well, and it's great. It's in good faith. Now, what I would say behind this, in terms of like what I've seen in other administrations, and even what I currently see right now, I can't help but to wonder this, right? We invest so much in public safety through police department or to Chicago Police Office. And I think we have a moment here in our history to just hit a pause and reevaluate. Are we getting our return of investment, by the way that we are funding current public safety initiatives? $11 million compared to what I see what the police budget really is, it's to me it's peanuts. And so here's why I say this to you too. Two examples that I'll illustrate. There was a study recently that demonstrates that in Chicago, your average homicide, it costs taxpayers about $1.5 million. So in essence, right, if I think about our data ready, and when we think about the control group and the treatment group, we know that the program in the last 2.5 years already has paid for itself. By preventing 20 homicides or 30 shootings, the approach itself funded. And so I think that's one way to look at this as well, right? Like, how are we investing our resources? What's working? What's not working? The second example that I'll give briefly, I had a young man, Mark Navarez. I've been mentoring him since he was about 15 years old. About late October, he was shot and killed by the police. Recently, I saw the videos. There's apparently the family has a good case, right? Because he was shot in the back. I won't go into the details of that. But here's the reason why I lift that example up. When Mark Navarez came home from prison, about a month later, he reached out to me and said, "Hey, how do I get into Ready?" And my response to him was, "Well, you live 1 block south of North Lawndale, so I can't connect you." And then his response is like, "Well, is this program only for Black people?" Keep in mind that the people that I serve, in the communities that I serve, 97% of my participants are Black or African American. And so he joked around that, and I said, "Well, let's find ways that I could support you." And we did, through a church and a couple of different things that we did. I think about how, if I would have been in a better position, I could have provided Ready for him, but I was limited. And I was married to a randomized controlled trial study, and I was also limited on the slots that I have for the men in our program. And yet, still, right, that at some point there will be a court settlement. It's probably going to be about $1 million. And I think to myself, that's $1 million that comes from taxpayers. $1 million that could have gone to a program like Ready or CP4P or CRED. And so I have to rationalize there, like, how do we justify that? How is it that we're willing to pay over $200 million in police overtime and court settlements, but as a city, we have a hard time really investing in promising programs or strategies as well? So I'm a little bit of a skeptic in that case, even though I'm going into this with the best hope I can, but I am somewhat skeptic.
Let me also correct the record. I agree with Eddie 100%, which is partly why we're talking about a down payment, but there's a lot of things that need to happen. The city actually has committed $36 million to violence prevention. It's 11 in the space that we're in, but the Department of Family Support Services recently sort of realigned some of this money to do some different things in violence prevention that they haven't done in the past. And then I know that some of the CARES Act money will be dedicated to violence prevention. So over a 2-year period, there's $36 million that they have invested in that direction. Just want to correct that.
Okay, great. I know you brought up ceasefire, so I'm going to go one by one here because I want to give our audience a little more detail about, yes, you have these programs, but what does it mean for someone that actually gets in your program? So we're going to start with Eddie. Can you tell us, I know I did some research, you have this 12-month program pathway. What is that? What do young person from these communities that comes in to your program, what is it like? What is that pathway for them? What do they get? And also, if you could all talk about a little bit, because I'm curious, what makes what you're doing different from ceasefire, or from what the ceasefire did?
Let me start with your second question first, and kind of work my way up. So ironically, I actually worked at ceasefire for 3.5 years in my early career. That's where I started my career. And I am extremely grateful for ceasefire's willingness, right, to hire people like myself. And what I mean by that, 3 months prior to me being hired, I had just finished completing 14 years and 3 months in prison. So I was sentenced to 29 years in prison from the ages of 18, and I came home when I was 32. And I started volunteering at a church, working with kids who were on probation. And from there, I got recruited into the ceasefire program at a little village, and then later on, in Chicago, through the public health office. Shortly after that, I was featured in a documentary called The Interrupters. Selfish plug in there for the documentary. But it was through the platform or the platform that I created for me that I started realizing, in addition to the fact that I was in undergraduate school and later on going to grad school, that I learned more about different theories and approaches and best practices to this work. So even programs like Ceasefire, when done correctly, it actually could have a huge impact in communities, whether it's the outreach or the interruption work, which typically takes place right after retaliation or preventing somebody from being shot. And so part of what was missing there, right, for quite some time, is that you would take someone like myself, right, who had this, story of incarceration, gang involvement, and you would deploy them into these communities to help reduce violence. And you would use a lot of times your own testimony or your own social capital, right, to just kind of be able to convince someone not to, harm someone else or to provide a glimpse of hope for that matter. But often I was falling short. And what I mean by that is, like, it's not like I had something to give them, right? They could turn around and do something different. So my philosophy has always been, if you want somebody to put their gun down and to step away from their specific kind of life that they're living, then you got to give them something to step into. And for me, that incorporates READI Chicago. READI Chicago it started off as an 18-month program. Now it's a 12-month program where we use specific data from the crime lab, which is our research partner out of the University of Chicago's crime lab. And we use specific data, right, to help identify individuals who are the highest risk of gun involvement. Those individuals, and I won't go into other details, are 7 times more likely compared to their peers in their own group to be a victim of gun violence. And so we meet them where they're at, and we provide an opportunity through our street outreach partners to engage them in what we call relentless engagement and offer them an opportunity for a quick job. Meaning, if they're willing, we are able to offer them a job like tomorrow. And so, so in many cases, out of the 1,200 plus men that I mentioned earlier, almost 700, almost 680 plus men already have taken us up on that offer on the jobs. But we also recognize, right, that our men, as Vaughn and Peter mentioned earlier, they are struggling with quite a bit. And part of it is so even when you're able to provide them a job, they're not going to sustain it because the soft skills that we often here on this call take for granted, they haven't fully developed yet, right? They don't know how to take instructions in some cases, how to show up on time in some other cases, right? They're still self-medicating as well through, marijuana and other narcotics. And so it's really important that we unpeel that, right, and provide what we call cognitive behavior therapy. And we compensate them for that. We used to do it 3 times a week. Now we offer it 5 days a week, for about 100 hours of CBT before we actually place them in a job. And these are companies that we already have been partnering with who are really lax in the way they hire people with backgrounds, and they actually have up more mobility in these employers' opportunities. So those are some of the things that I would say of what services look like. I could tell you that the last thing that I'll say is, our retention to the services that we provide for our men are about a 57% retention, particularly after 6 months, which is huge when you compare to other programs, Boca and CEO. So we feel really good given the fact that who we're serving and given the fact that we're seeing their attendance. And particularly when you see more increases of CBT, cognitive behavior therapy, you see even more of their attendance and less behavior or risk behaviors. So that for us is a huge, huge win. So a lot more than I could say, but typically it's an 8-hour program. They are with us from 9 in the morning to 5 o'clock, in which they receive what I just mentioned a moment ago, the CBT, the cognitive behavior therapy. They receive professional development through employment opportunities and other job skills as well.
Okay, Peter, same question to you. What does a person coming in and working with CRED, what do they experience?
Well, usually the first person that they talk to is an outreach worker, and it's, someone who has shared a lot of experiences in life with them. So the guy, the participant may be a 22-year-old guy. The outreach worker may be 35, maybe someone who has served some time and been through the criminal justice system, and is now out and is now stabilized. And that might be the first person they talk to. The next person they talk to might be a therapist. And, so now you have a second adult in their life who's offering them, regular counsel, helping them just say things that they haven't been able to say in their life, the trauma that they've dealt with. Eddie and Vaughn can tell you some of these kids witnessed their first act of violence when they're tiny children, and they witnessed their first shooting when they're 10 or 11. They touched their first gun at the age of 12, and they're surrounded by violence by the time they're 14 or 15. That's a lot of unaddressed trauma, and no one sits them down and asks them how they feel about that, and they struggle even to talk about it. So that's a second adult in their life. A third adult is a job coach. Once they kind of get through a certain stage of the program, they start to get some employment and training, and now they have a coach who helps them understand some of the soft skills Eddie was talking about, whether it's show up on time or learn how to take direction, or even learn how to get kind of disciplined by a boss without exploding, or just how to cope with that kind of stuff. And then we also provide life coaches, which is really someone who stays close to them when they experience additional traumas. Some of them may get themselves out of the life, but they still have a brother or a sibling or a family member or a good friend who's still caught up, and something happens to him, and the next thing you know, they're having a terrible experience again, and they're going to slip back. So that's like at least 4 adults in their life who care about them, who talk to them, who check in on them regularly, who they can call. That's kind of a lot of what the program does.
Okay, Vaughn, tell us about CP4P in a little more detail and what someone experiences when they get involved. Oh no, he's
You're on
muted.
mute.
You're on mute.
Sorry about that.
No worries.
So from a structural perspective, we are about sort of 4 pillars. So in Communities Partner for Peace, the 4 stands for hyperlocal, trauma-informed, nonviolence, and restorative practices. So the hyperlocal part is such that we like to have a local partner who's, sort of physically located in the community, in or near the community that they serve, so that we're building up the capacity of the local organizations to have sort of the infrastructure for creating peace in their neighborhoods. So each of those organizations is armed, like I said before, with outreach workers similar to READI and CRED, where they canvass their neighborhood on a regular basis, mostly Wednesdays through Sundays. And they're really trying to build relationships with the people who are most vulnerable to gun violence. Once they build that relationship and the participant is willing, then they get assigned a case manager. That case manager really works with them sort of in a customized way to figure out what needs does that particular participant have. So we also, as part of our set of services, provide free behavioral health services. So we have a director of behavioral health services that sits on my team, and she has a team of 7 behavioral health specialists. Hopefully we'll get to 11 at some point to serve our whole network, but they provide free behavioral health services, whether that's one-on-one, whether it's family, whether it's group therapy. We have what we call our Justice Corps, where we have a team of attorneys that provide free civil legal aid services for our participants who often have challenges with the law. And we want to make sure that, we sort of take away any of those constraints with our Justice Corps. And we have a small job readiness team where we subsidize both GED attainment and job readiness services. So if you go through our 2-week JRT, we'll pay you $300 for those, a week for those 2 weeks to go through job readiness training. And then we have monthly job fairs to hopefully secure employment for our participants. Now, we stick with these guys even if they're secure employment. They still have access to the outreach worker and the case manager and the behavioral health team and the justice court team. And so again, that's really similar to what these guys do, but more. Our job is really more building up the capacity for the local organizations to be able to stand that up and to execute on that on a regular basis.
All right, interesting. All right, I'm going to go over. I did a couple screen grabs of some basically data visualizations from Chicago Cred's site. I thought they were interesting, and I think I want to hear your take on them. So if Eric, you can put up the per capita homicide rates. Wonderful. Okay. So, I mean, there's no mistaking this. And I want your opinion from all of your work, which is on the street doing this amazing work. Why is Chicago, in your opinion, so much an outlier compared to New York and LA? And I think if you add up New York and LA's numbers, they would still be less than Chicago. You guys, and we can open up to any of you. Do you have opinions on why Chicago is so much higher than those cities? They're similar sized.
I could tell you one thing is that they've been trying to do some of this work longer than we have.
Yep. Yeah, that was what I was going to say.
Everybody has their kind of transformative moments. LA's was the Rodney King riots, but it wasn't actually until a big scandal 7 or 8 years later, the Rampart scandal, that people really, the level of brokenness in the police department was just super apparent. Chicago had a big scandal in the 1950s, but then the more recent stuff was the Laquan McDonald video in 2015 is when it came out. The incident happened in 2014. So that was kind of one of our watershed moments. So we're sort of just behind them in some ways. That's one factor. I'm sure there's others. I'm sure Eddie and Vaughn can add to that, but I know that's one of them.
I think you go back to some of the things we said earlier, just in terms of housing discrimination. I think one of the things that LA and Chicago have in common is sort of street organizations and the prevalence of that. I think the history of organized crime in Chicago and New York is similar, but the investment to address it, we've just lagged behind on that. I think the other part that we have to look at in terms of New York and LA is how they policed. I think they incarcerated a lot of people and they gentrified. I think those are just facts. They did make investments, but they also gentrified. So if you look at Brooklyn today, if you look at Harlem today, they don't look like they did yesteryear. And one of the things we're committed to here in Chicago is to become a safer city, but by healing the people that are here and creating a home for the people that are here. And we don't want, our folks to be displaced in the same way they were in the cities.
That's a great point. That's part of what I wanted to share, but you're absolutely right around that. Often I think that it is it's an unjust comparison when you look at Chicago, New York, and LA. And I know that we're often compared to them because of the size of our city. But I think a more fair comparison would be, what are some of the local cities around Midwest? Minneapolis or Milwaukee, Cleveland, Indianapolis, Detroit. Because I think we would see something very differently. I also, this past year, 2020, we saw spikes in violence increase in the top 40 cities in our country, including New York and LA. And part of it was a result, at least according to studies, is a result of COVID. But there were other challenges along the way. Atlanta, for example, had almost 300% of increase, where here in Chicago we saw 50% increase of shootings and homicides, right? So I think that there's a lot that we could also see in these studies about what's happening. And I would simply point out to what we just mentioned just a moment ago, is the larger investment that goes into these communities, and not thinking about a 1 or 2 year strategy, but thinking about a 10 or 20 year strategy. And that's also really important. If Vaughn made a really good point earlier, and I commend him for this, which is too often politicians, right, They care about their position, their role, right, their employment, and so they're not willing to always take these bold decisions, right, to do the right thing. And that's difficult, right? It's difficult because if you look at our city here in Chicago, for far too long, we just haven't had too many of those leaders, right, to make bold decisions around this. Um, the prime example that I'll give you, here we are, all three of us, kind of expressing our gratitude to our city for their investment, right, of the $30+ million that Vaughn pointed out. And I'm grateful for that. But again, I think about why did it take us this long, and why only 30 million plus? What's the city's strategy to get us to $200 million? Why is it that philanthropy has had to flip the bill, where when you think about taxpayers' dollars and where they're going to, like it's an uneven comparison too. So I think about all those different things in light of your question, right? Because there are things that the city's government and people did, right, for a certain amount of years to kind of get to where they're at too. Now the unfortunate part is there has been a lot of gentrification, that particularly with poor neighborhoods. We see some of that here in Chicago, like in the Humboldt Park, the Logan Square area, Pilsen. When Peter talked about earlier about the early 1990s Chicago, listen, I went to prison for homicide in 1994 when Chicago was seeing homicides up to 1,000. So Pilsen today isn't the same Pilsen that it was 20 years ago, 30 years ago. Neither was Humboldt Park and neither was Logan Square. And I could go down a list of that too. So while I think that we have to think about in the context of like where do we see fewer violence in the cities and what really attributed to that, and how do we get our own 10-year, 20-year plan as well?
Yeah, one other factor, Tracy, that should be mentioned is the availability of guns. For a couple of reasons, we are surrounded by states with very different gun laws, very weak gun laws, in my opinion. Some would call them something different, maybe freedom or whatever. But it's really easy to get guns, and because we're Chicago, we're the transportation center of America. There's just a lot of pipelines of activity that come up from whether it's just from the South, places where the gun culture is different. We confiscate like 10,000 guns a year in Chicago. That's just an astounding number of them. That's 30 a day, really, in this city. So I just think that we may have more guns than some of those other places. It might be easier to get them.
And Peter, I'll add one thought to that, right? Like we do have a gun issue. We have a gun issue here. But I have to ask the question, right? Like, why is it that our men, and in some cases women, feel the need to have a gun with them? That to me is the most important question that I would ask. Because it's not that the majority are like, hey, I'm gonna go shoot somebody, but they often feel they have to carry a gun to be protected, to feel safe. So that to me goes back to your comments around public safety and what really legitimizes our communities and for them to feel that they are safe. I live in the west side of Chicago. I live in LaGrange Park. My kids are gonna have great schools so long as I continue to live here. And I think about what my wife and I have been able to provide for them thus far. That's not where I grew up at. I grew up in the southwest side of Chicago, a little village. Got Farragut High School. That was my neighboring school. Low attendance rate. There's all the things that I could say about the school. But at the end of the day, right, it's like where you're born to really makes a big difference. Who your parents are make a big difference. And I think what we're trying to do in this line of work in our own little circle and collectively is to try to find a way to balance the scale, right? To be able to give our men and women and our staff, for that matter, an opportunity, right, to really have a fighting chance, right, to not only survive the streets, but to also have a job where they can sustain their families themselves.
I was privy. I won't say what what think tank it was here in DC, which is where now I live. But this happened years ago when I was traveling here from Chicago. But I was in a think tank's office, and a researcher was telling me a story. They were giving some presentation for one of the foundations in Chicago about their work. and the foundation was MacArthur. I'll just come on and say it. And I think the head of MacArthur was in the meeting, and he seemed perturbed, even though the think tank was reporting good results. And he like interrupted the presentation. He goes, sit down, and he goes, listen, can someone here, any one of you PhDs, give me a damn number. What is it going to take to turn this community around? Not gentrify, but turn it around with the people in it. What's it gonna take? Give me a number. I'm sick of these little programs that we're doing, and we're not actually solving any of the problems. And someone came out with something like, I think it was $300 or $350 million. And that was the end of the discussion, right? Because they were like, well, we're not gonna invest that amount of money in any of these neighborhoods, right? Because getting to Eddie's talking about all of you, like, what's the long-term strategy to turn these around? What kind of actual investment would it take? And that was the number that was given out, and the head of MacArthur at the time, this is years ago, freaked out, right? And
I'm curious. I'm curious how they got to that $350 million number.
Well, I think he just wanted it right then and there. He had to say it. They had to give him a number right then and there. So it was just totally off the cuff. And whether I'm misremembering it, it was 400 or 250, whatever. It was some number that just was so large, it was inconceivable that that MacArthur and other foundations in the city could actually invest in any community, let alone all of them.
Yeah, I think for me, I'm glad you brought that point up, because I think that it's, for me, like I just try to live my life as freely as possible and tell the truth in any forum that I can be in. I just think have a conversation about reparations, because this is a long road, and we are in a capitalistic society, and money was stolen, and people were cut out of wealth building mechanisms, and people generated wealth for other people in this country. And that needs to be repaired and restored. And that is a number we could actually get to. There's been people studying this for a long period of time. And I think we absolutely have to look at that.
Okay. The last question I'm going to ask the three of you is, and part of the reason I wanted to talk to you was you participated in a press conference with Chicago Cred on January 6th, a day that will now be live in infamy, but not for your press conference, but for the coup attempt that happened a mile from where I'm living. And I was so happy to see them, the insurrectionists, staying at the hotel next to where I live. That was a really great thing to experience. But in that press conference, I believe there was a commitment, a goal setting of reducing homicides 20% a year over the next 5 years. So I guess I want to go round robin here, around to all three of you. How do you plan? How does the city do that? That's a really bold goal to set.
Was that last year that we did that? Did we do
that? We reaffirmed it this year, but we actually started doing. We did it last year. We as I mentioned, 2016 was a bad year. We shot up from about 500 homicides to nearly 800. And 17, 18, and 19, we had 13 to 15% declines every year. And we were just challenging ourselves at the beginning of 2020 to up it a little bit more. If we could get down to 20% a year, we could get under 400 homicides, which is a number we have not been under since 1965 as a city. So we set that goal last January, and in fact, the city went up 50%. So when we got together this year to have our press conference, we were asking, well, what do we do? Do we change our goal? Do we modify our goal? And fundamentally, we still want to get under 400 homicides as a first step, and then we still want to get on par with New York and LA, which is even lower, which given Chicago's population would be closer to 150 or 200. I mean, we just want to stretch ourselves to keep pushing. Now, we're now starting from a much higher place. We're starting from whatever Eddie said, 769 instead of 495, which is what we had in 19. So we just don't want to back away from it and say, well, we're abandoning our goal. No, we have to keep pushing ourselves to see if we can get back down. We have to make this year 2020. We have to make 2020 an aberration, not a trend. And unfortunately, we're off to a bad year in 2021 as well. So we have a lot of work to do.
Yeah, I would say on my end, right, to answer your question, I want to start off by saying our communities, they need hope. And so whether or not the 20% reduction or 30% or 50% reduction, right, it could be aspirational. The thing is that we should be working towards that. We should be working towards like it's zero homicide. And I know it's just it's a pipe dream, but for somebody, right, like when I have to visit a family of one of our participants who've been killed, for that person, right, like for at the larger scheme of things, all they are is a stat. It's a number. But for that family at that moment, right, it's their son, is their loved one, it's their boyfriend, it's their husband, it's somebody's father. And so I remind myself of that when we have these aspirations, like what's really behind it. I also find hope, and I think this is part of the solution. You have three great organizations on this call. You have CP4P in this coalition. You have CRED, who's doing some amazing work in the South Side, and then you have READI Chicago. And so it is really important for us as we think about reducing violence in these communities and to get to this number, is that we have to continue, right, to work together, to find ways that we could leverage our best practice, right, of what's working, what's not working, share those lessons learned among each other so we don't repeat the same mistakes, right? And how do we identify institutions or leaders that have integrity, that are transparent, that are willing to roll up their sleeves and push forward, regardless of the size of the organization or regardless of their title and position. And I think that's just a part of it at the community level. And there's the government level, like the city. Again, the city at the end of the day, they hold the biggest purse strings here, in our community. And, we do need Lori Lightfoot and her office, right, to really invest in this. And they have to do their magic, right, to think about the resources that are needed to really make this work actually happen. When I think about what Vaughn mentioned earlier about the ability to build capacity in those communities, it's critical because, I'm going to say something that might sound a little controversial. I don't believe putting more money into a community for the sake of putting more money into a community, either because they're black or brown. What often happens is that there's poor management. There is no real impact of those dollars. There is no coordination, right, or coalition building to tackle either a service or a policy issue. And so my hope and what my hope is that the city continues to invest in this, and the state continues to invest in this, the county, but that the partners that you see here and others that we also represent at this table, we continue to work together towards this number.
Yeah, I like what Eddie had to say because for me, it's about it's a little less about the number. One of the things you will often hear me say is that it's never going to be a straight line down. It's going to be hopefully a spiral down is I think the best we can hope for given the conditions that we have. But I think, for me, it's about perfecting our craft in our local communities, doing the work with the utmost integrity and being on a constant, continuous improvement mentality. And that's, like I'm a former athlete, and that's you wake up every day and you try to get better that day at what you do. And I think that's the same way that, our partners, us and our partners have to go about our day. And if we do our best work on a day-to-day basis in a sustained way and build these relationships and sit with these folks that we need to serve and help them heal through love to get through that trauma and to get on the path to a dignified life, that's ultimately what's going to stop the shootings and killings is more people who are healed and skilled and wake up every day with a purpose for their life and the lives of their families.
Okay, gentlemen, Eddie, Peter, Vaughn, thank you so much for participating. I really appreciate it. And hopefully we'll be checking in with you intermittently to see what you're doing, see what's going on new. I just think we can't talk enough about what's going on in the street work that you all are doing. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right. Hello, everyone. We're going to go through a couple segments. I want to once again thank Peter, Eddie, and Vaughn for participating. It's fascinating discussion, finding out about their work, finding about how it's measured, what actually happens. They all have unique approaches, but they're working together, and that's great news. I don't think there could be enough coordination of what's going on. And I'm also very happy to hear that they are not satisfied. They're thankful for, but not satisfied for the city's commitment through this point. I'm happy for the $36 million, and yeah, that's an improvement. Improving over what Rahm Emanuel or Richard Daley put in is not something to pat you on the back for. Last year, I think in 19, the city collected something like 985, something close to that number, 985 million into the tax increment financing fund, which is an off-the-book slush fund, more or less, for the mayor. How you can't redirect some of that from subsidizing the building of big buildings downtown, and instead turning it into the communities. I understand where Eddie's coming from about just throwing money at programs. I agree with that, but I think a better income, pulling from Andrew Yang a little bit, universal basic income into the communities that experience the most gun violence in Chicago. Experimenting with that program for 3 or 5 years to see the impact, I think we'd see great results, and I would certainly welcome that study. So we're going to move to a couple segments here. Basically just about news coverage on crime and violence in Chicago. The first one is a article by Patrick Smith from WBEZ. And the title of the article is "Chicago Creates a New Policy Banning Retaliation Against Officers Who Report Misconduct." And I want to read a couple of quotes from the article. It's amazing to me that in 2021 we're creating this policy. Mayor. So anyways, I just think that's ridiculous. I think that should have been the headline. CPD creates policy that should have had for 1,000 years. You want to look for why a department's broken. It takes them this long to create this policy. Superintendent Brown does say in the article, he's quoted in the article talking about how it, they've always stood against retaliation, but now was the time to put this into a general order. Whoa. They've been sued, as Patrick Smith points out in the article, a few times at least in the last couple of years over retaliation, over the last several years, certainly. And it didn't dawn on anyone before him. It didn't dawn on Mr. Brown in his first year, or I guess this is wrapping up his first year. I do want to talk about a quote from him in the article that I think is really fascinating and disappointing at the same point. "It is the most convoluted disciplinary system I've ever seen," talking about the Chicago's disciplinary system. Who was previously the police chief in Dallas, which Brown was. "It just goes in so many different directions and comes back. And the timing of it takes too long." Stunning. It takes too long. The system, the convoluted system is due particularly to the union contract and the desperate need for Chicagoans to layer after layer of new civilian overview, hoping that it somehow fixes a system that is completely broken. So his lack of understanding why it is the way it is telling, right? He probably should have a better idea of why it is what it is, but he's not going to hear that. He's not listening external to the organization, and he's certainly not going to get it internal about why the system is so screwed up. It's just not something he is going to hear. It would be nice if he's going to come out and say something like that he'd have the context around it. But the police department, the police officers themselves are going to say, well, it's our union contract. And the fact that none of the agencies we ever created have ever worked and stopped us from beating people or robbing people or from rampant corruption. So, of course, he's not going to hear that internally. So that you get otherwise now you get quotes from him about it that come out this way that just show that he's just not caught up into the system. It'd be fascinating if he had evidence of a better operating system, but this is just not how the system is operated. I've helped. I was involved after our 2009 or during we were doing our study with the Chicago Coalition for Police Accountability. We did a study on the police board back in 2009. During that time, I helped with members of the coalition rewrite the ordinance that authorized the police board and detailed their operations, and we put in a lot more transparency. It hasn't worked. We're probably weeks away from filing suit against the police board for a multiple count FOIA violations, Basic Freedom of Information Act violations. They just don't want to give up what they do. They just don't want you to see what they do. And this is, under Lori Lightfoot, who, by the way, was the president of the police board before becoming mayor. So, I helped create that police board ordinance. I helped write the ordinance that created the Deputy Inspector General's office, Deputy Public Safety Inspector General in the Inspector General's office. And I also helped write the ordinance, which was the same one that created the Citizen Office of Police Accountability that replicated or replaced the Independent Police Review Authority. And neither of those organizations, at least in my opinion at this point, work. I should say the Deputy Public Safety Inspector General, that office seems to work. They put out some great audits and reports this year. So, but IPRA and COPRA, neither one worked at any great level, and they still remain not working. I'm sure they're understaffed and under-resourced, but they're still not working, in my opinion. We're hoping to get the head of COPA on the show in the coming weeks, and we can talk about that. Okay. In this next segment, in our last segment of the day, it is a story from Manny Ramos, I believe, from the Sun-Times. Lightfoot's executive order will help people alleging police misconduct. So, what is this about? This is about the fact that when Anjanette Young's case became public through the leaking of video, body cam video, Anjanette Young never went to COPA and filed a complaint. What they did is filed a lawsuit. Now, for some reason, that took some period of time. It took a period of time for COPA to find out about it. It took a period of time for COPA to get Anjanette Young or someone from her, one of her lawyers, to sit down with them, file a complaint, so that investigation was going. But during that time, Anjanette both sought access to the video and her lawyer access to the video via the discovery process within the lawsuit, but also through the Illinois Freedom of Information Act. And of course, like Chicago does, lies, cheats, steals. This is what they do. They denied her FOIA request. So, which they had absolutely no basis for. Zero. Maybe for the first month, but that's really it. It should have been released, if not within the first 30 days, maybe sooner. They denied it. And it didn't get made public until her lawyer got it through discovery. At least that's what's alleged by the city. And they leaked it to Channel 2, Dave Savini at Channel 2, and that became public. That's how we saw it. It shouldn't take that. So now this general order by Lightfoot is supposed to alleviate that to some, but you got to watch the language, okay, about how this is going. And remember, when we talk about this, Mayor Lightfoot was a partner at Mayor Brown, making $1 million a year. That's a big law firm. She was making $1 million a year as a partner. And so when you question how in the world does the city, with a mayor that was making $1 million a year as a lawyer, put out a policy that's vague? That's a good question. So I'm going to read you some of the article and we can talk about it. Under the executive order signed by Mayor Lightfoot, people who have filed complaints with the Civilian Office of Police Accountability, COPA, can obtain the information without needing to file a formal request under the Freedom of Information Act. The order allows the alleged victims to file a complaint with COPA for materials related to the incident. So they have to file, I don't know what file a complaint is. They have to file some request with COPA to get access to the materials about their own case. Then COPA will send the request within 3 days to the CPD and the city's law department. Okay, that seems okay. Here's the kicker. Here you go. Unless the video being requested falls under the city's video release policy, the materials will be released within 30 calendar days. Why? Why would it matter if it falls under the video release policy? What is the video release policy? So in brutality complaints, shootings, and I think brutality complaints, but I might be wrong. It might just be shootings. The city instituted a policy under ROM that was 60 days. Those videos have to be released by COPA up on their website, which I think is through Vimeo, actually. Has to be released within 60 days. So the wording makes it seem here, if you read that, that if you're filing suit about something that has to do with brutality and or shootings, you're actually not going to get it to 60 days because it's mandated to be released in the 60 days. I think it's only shootings now. If I think about it, so even if you file a request on you get shot or hurt, and then you file a request day 2, and you do it, and it gets to the CPD and law department in day 5, they're going to follow the video release policy, and you're not going to get it for 55 days. That has to be on purpose, and it has to be trickery, massaging the language to benefit the city. You know, when you want to get these interviews done quicker, mandate every CPD officer with a union rep has to respond to a subpoena or a request for investigation from COPA within 24 hours. The union has to have someone on call to do it and be there, and they have to be and sit for that investigation. These investigations take far too long. the CPD shouldn't need 60 days to wait for anything. They probably could do less than even 30 days. It is just, it's just wrong. And what I think the city is saying is, well, we have to do a proper investigation. We don't want the video out and tainting access to statements from people. That I can give you 5 or 10 days. You know what? If COPA needs more resources and they need more investigations to go door to door when COVID is gone, then they need the resources they need to get that video out as soon as possible. 60 days, 30 days, it shouldn't need to do that. You don't want to taint what people say. I get that. Here's the funny thing, ladies and gentlemen. Under the collective bargaining, I think the officers have the ability to see the video, any video in an incident that the city has, before they give their statements. Or if they give a statement before, they're able to go look at the video and make changes to the statement. That is all wrong. We have one question I want to get to from Jim Collins through Facebook. Are they dragging their feet to discourage people from filing suit or for them to give up? No, I think the city's argument is they want as clean and untainted set of witnesses as possible. So by releasing the video instantly or within a day or two, you're not giving COPA time to go out and hear from people on their version of what happened without seeing the video. And I think there is some merit to that, but I also think that standard should stay for the officer. The officer shouldn't get any access to the video. You tell us what happened, just like the supposed victim has to, the alleged victim has to, and just like any of the witnesses. They don't get to watch the video to refresh their recollection. And you're a trained professional being paid good money to be an officer, and you're trained, and you're given a gun and a license to kill. You shouldn't have to look at the video. So if they told us, if the city came and said, you know what, yes, we want you to have the video, but we're going to give it 10 days before you get it, or have everyone sign a non-disclosure agreement in cases where you're worried about the video tainting eyewitness recollections and make them sign something so they can't release it for 10 or 15 or 20 days, or maybe even 30. They can't release it to the media. I think that's perfectly, there's something to be found there. But giving the cop access, the accused officer access to the video, and not giving it to the public or the witnesses or the alleged victim is just wrong. But once again, you have a rather ridiculous, obscene, horrific police union contract that here's to protect any officers, no matter how bad the corruption is, no matter how bad or what they do. That's what's going on. All right. So thank you, everyone. I want to thank you for tuning in. It was a great show. Thanks again to Peter, Eddie, and Vaughn. They were great. It was a fascinating discussion. Real quick, we have Sarah Stout next week at 12 p.m. Central Time. Once again, on March 1st, we go to 3 times a week, and we go 5:30 Central with those, and we'll be streaming 3 days a week, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, at 5:30 Central. Thanks again, everyone. If you have story ideas, hit us on any of the social media. We're streaming to now. We're happy to, dig up some conversations for you if you have ideas of who you want to see on the show or questions you'd like us to address. Thanks again, and we'll see you next week, Wednesday, 12 p.m. Central, right here on the Chicago Justice Show. Thanks for tuning in.